will discuss the human cost of climate change. Moderating the panel is Gaurav Gupta, who is a partner and the Asia Director at Dalberg Advisors. He founded Dalberg's first Asia office in Mumbai, later expanding into Delhi, Singapore, and other cities in Southeast Asia and Australia. Gaurav supports global development institutions, governments, corporations, and civil society towards achieving their sustainable development goals. With that, if I could please request Gaurav on stage, who will then invite his panelists.
I didn't realize I had to invite you individually. Why don't you just come up on stage? And Eric, do we have you in the audience there? Where are you? There you go. Oh, wonderful. Do you guys want to come on board? And I'll introduce you while you're on stage. Come on. Yeah, she wants a grand entrance, I know. Thank you for bearing with us, everybody. So I know we stand between you and pleasurable drinks, but I have a great set of panelists and actually Sunitha Narayan joining us on video. I'm just going to introduce the topic and these fine folks. Although, you know, these days everyone looks everyone up on LinkedIn and so forth, so I'll try and keep it a little bit interesting. But firstly, the topic, which is a walk on thin ice, I'm going to just change it a little bit. It says factoring in the human cost of climate change, and I think what we're actually going to talk about is factoring in the human, right? Because I think the opportunity in climate change and what we're going to discuss is how you bring that sort of human-centeredness to the whole set of solutions, opportunities. There are costs, but there are opportunities. It's not simply a cost equation, and that's what we'll discuss. So who do we have on stage? Well, firstly, Sunitha Narayan, who will be joining us on video, and she'll actually give a great introduction as to this whole question of intersectionality, the human side, as it runs through this topic. Sunitha, as I think many of you know, is a phenomenal environmentalist, writer, Director General of CSE, and I think many of us know from her fortnightly down-to-earth publication. And I'm excited to hear from her. Safina Hussain. So just a little secret, this is a little bit difficult for me because my second job, I mean these days we all need 2 jobs to make ends meet, is that I work for Safina. So if I give her softball questions, that will be the reason. But Safina Hussain is a warrior, and lucky for us, she's chosen to fight for educating girls. And to date, has helped put more than 1.1 million girls back into school. So I know, I know when we talk about scale, like, I should talk to Safina about building scale. She's done that in a really rapid time frame. And Educate Girls, you know, beyond those 1.1 million, because of the work in those communities, has reached over 15.5 million beneficiaries. Great to have Eric with us. Eric is the Managing Director for Philanthropy at the Climate Leadership Initiative. He's the one who is going around and making sure that philanthropists are making important commitments to the climate, and I think we'll hear a lot from him about how we get them to take the human into account as part of that. With over 20 years of experience within climate and social justice, it's great to have you on the panel, Eric. And Ajaita, known each other for a long time, and Ajaita runs Frontier Markets, which is an enterprise built to empower and uplift rural women through financial independence. 20,000 women entrepreneurs, over 1 million customers. So again, a great person to have a conversation about what it takes to scale. But those women and the enterprise you run are sitting at the center of both experiencing but also solving climate change. So I think we'll have a discussion about that. Before I put my own spin on this, I'm going to ask if we can hear from Sunitha Narayan about this topic and about what intersectionality means when we discuss it in the context of climate change. So if you can roll tape. Thank you. share with us?
To join the Dasra Philanthropy Forum on factoring the human cost of climate change. I'm really sorry I'm not there with you in New York, but I do hope that I can contribute to your very important deliberations. What is very clear is that we are seeing today in our world that climate change has the harshest impacts on the very poor in our world. They are victims of climate change. They have not contributed to the stock of greenhouse gases which are in the atmosphere. But at the end of it, we are losing the development dividend. Years of investment in building healthcare, schools, drinking water, sanitation systems, livelihood support, it is all being lost because of recurrent natural disasters. We need to put a human face on climate change events that we are seeing in our world. We also need to understand how adaptation to climate change is really about accelerated development. We need to do more development, not less, because of climate change, but we need it with increased pace and scale. We cannot afford the mistakes of the past. The fact we know today is that when we see the worst impacts of climate change, natural disasters, human-made disasters, that this is not the impact of climate change alone. It is also about the way we are managing our land, our water, our agricultural systems. And this is exacerbating the impacts because of extreme weather events. So when you look at floods that are happening in our part of the world, and we know today the huge human cost because of flooding, say in Pakistan, 3/4 of the country underwater. Just think of the development cost of that flood on Pakistan and how vulnerability has been increased. But why only Pakistan? In my own country, the high-tech city of Bengaluru has gone underwater. Look at the economic costs of that. The fact is that these are costs. But we also know that this is not climate change alone, that these regions are definitely getting unusual rain, more than 300% of their annual rain in a matter of days in certain cases. But it is also because of the mismanagement of the floodplains. We're building where we shouldn't. We are destroying our drainage systems. We do not protect our lakes and ponds. All that is exacerbating the impact. But this also tells us what we need to do to cope with climate change. We need to bring the sectoral, the intersectoral understanding of development, the art of policy and practice, so that we can rebuild, we can invest more in building resilience in society. We may not be able to weather all the storms, but we will be able to rebuild societal strength to be able to do better. Building resilience then is about investing in local agriculture, food systems that are regenerative, that are good for the soil and water so that they will be more adaptive to shocks. But this is where we also need to look at local breeds of livestock, local biodiversity, which has an ability to be able to live with that ecosystem, which will provide nutrition, but not at the cost of nature. Building resilience is about investing in local water systems so that they can be sponges for extreme rain events, so that they can recharge the groundwater, which we will need over the long, prolonged periods of drought. But it is also about making sure that we can recycle and reuse every drop of wastewater, because we have to both augment, but also most efficiently use our resources. The bottom line is that we have to plan even more deliberately than before and invest in people and build their capabilities. We need to ensure that livelihoods are built on sustainable use of natural resources. This is also the huge co-benefit that we can get for climate change. Investment in green, regenerative agriculture, in planting trees so that people benefit. And if we do not do so, we know that we will only see more human suffering as people lose their abilities to cope, and we will see more conflict and more migration, which in turn will add to insecurity in our world. So we have a unique moment to reinvest, to think again of the need to do much more, much faster, because of the emergency that the planet is facing today. Thank you very much. I hope this will be useful in your deliberations, and I will look forward to interacting more in the future.
It's always unusual because she can't hear us clapping, but still, I think no one could have done a better job in sort of introducing this topic. Let me just break it down to what I think we're talking about, right? All of those effects really break down to two: intersectionality, the fact that as we're engaging on climate, there are very differential effects and opportunities for women in India, both on, especially on race and caste. There are the intersectional elements of how you get stuff done, where we have to take all of these varied experiences and the opportunities that can also throw up into account. I think that's one side of the equation. The other is co-benefits, which is when you do things on climate, how do you do things on climate that does other things, because you need to do both, otherwise you're not even going to get the climate thing done. And the way I see that is when I started my journey in this space, and I worked with Al Gore trying to get his NGO off the ground, it used to be a scientific equation, right? Let's stop taking molecules from the ground that should remain in the ground and sticking them in the air, and if some of those carbon molecules are in the air, let's take them out of the air. But this is not a scientific equation only, it's a human equation. We've learned that the hard way over the last 10 to 20 years, and what we are now trying to do is try and bring those two things together, otherwise it's going to be sticky. If you want to get rid of coal in India, you have to solve the job issue, you have to solve the cross-subsidy issues. If France wants to put up petrol prices as it needed to have figured out that there are truck drivers who are going to really suffer, and truck drivers can block highways. This type of stuff is playing out everywhere. So even if you're here because you care only about the molecules, you have to design for the human, and I think that's what we're going to discuss. But that's very theoretical of me, so let's make it on the ground. I mean, one of the things that I think is a great strength of Safina herself, but also the team at Educate Girls, is they're just constantly sitting in the classroom, they're constantly knocking on doors. And I want you to take us from this lovely place in New York back down to the people who are experiencing the highest vulnerability. Because you just wrote a report, kind of caught me off guard. I've always known you just as this strong educationalist, and it was like education for climate action. And so I want you to share a bit about what you're seeing, how climate is entering your world in the education space.
Yeah, no, thank you, Gaurav. This is my voting.
I'm not sure. So.
Give me your mic. So this report, like, yeah, is absolutely right. You know, so about a year ago, Education Commission, Malala Fund, Education Outcomes Fund, Amel, Wendy Kopp, like a bunch of us sort of came together and saying, you know, what is happening? Because I spent like a chunk of my time, you know, working in villages. I was seeing a lot of stuff. They were seeing a lot of stuff. And so we came out of this report of Education for Climate. And you can all read it, but so I won't like talk about it, but I'm going to give you the gist of the argument that we have sort of been thinking about and building. And the gist of the argument is, you know, we have to like control the temperatures, like the 1.5 degrees every decade for like 3 decades, right? What's happening right now in the focus is very much on like solar panels, infrastructure, you know, everything, you know. And we were thinking about this, and we were like, you know what, the first decade, let's imagine that we managed to stick a solar panel on every roof, every window, my forehead, your forehead, like everywhere, any available space, right? What are we going to do in decade number 2 and decade number 3? And the decade number 2 and the decade number 3, what we will require is to be able to consume differently and produce differently. And we're like, oh my God, if we need to do that, this is about behavior change is about relearning is about Thank you very much. So, we're like, education is the absolute basic pillar. And now there's like all this data saying, 20 to 37% of that you can reduce, emission. I don't know the vocabulary of the whole climate thing. So if I say like rubbish, it just means that I don't know the exact words. But like they're saying like that much reduction you can have just through behavior change of individuals and households. And so then we were like, oh my God. So therefore, how does education come to climate? And there are three pillars that we think it is. One, climate literacy. In the Western world, particularly, we need climate literacy baked in. This is where the highest consumption is. We need to build that behavior change for the generation today so that by next decade and beyond, they are consuming and producing differently. The second piece is skilling. If we want a green economy, a green economy, we are going to have to reskill a lot of people. You can tell somebody saying, shut down your coal mine, but what is that poor person going to do? And that's where education will again have to play a huge role in the green economy, is in the reskilling, and a huge amount of investment needs to be made today. The third aspect is really the sort of adaptation and climate justice aspect. We who are privileged are not going to pay the price of this as much as those on the front lines who are going to be poor, vulnerable, women, tribals, people who live in the villages in really climate vulnerable areas, right? And education needs to come to them at speed to actually be able to build the resilience so that they can live in a climate adjusted world. And so that's how we're kind of seeing it in the long-winded answer, and that's the argument in this paper that we have come out with.
Thank you, Safina. And I think staying with the theme of just understanding what's happening on the ground, Ajay, you're working with 20,000 women, and I think they're rural entrepreneurs. They're actually on the front lines, exactly what Safina's talking about in terms of the experiencing climate. But at the same time, they're out there, distributing these solar panels, right? Distributing solar lighting. I'm curious, how do they see themselves? Do they see themselves as victims of climate change? Do they see themselves as climate warriors? Or are they just trying to do a job?
I mean, it's a great question. So, I mean, just putting this in context, though, because I do agree that climate is no longer about putting a solar panel on your forehead. It really is not. I think it's so much more than that. So we as Frontier Markets have evolved in our own climate thesis, right? We realized that it's about divest, invest. It's about consumption, behavior change. It's about thinking about practices. And I think one of the things that we've understood is that women actually play a very critical role in these decision-making angles, because consumption decisions on a household level, waste decisions on a household level, the ability to actually be a supply chain or value chain person and making smarter decisions really comes from the stem of where she sits. So if you educate her, incentivize her, also give her the right tools, she actually becomes your warrior of actually making this happen in this beautiful way. So our definition of climate is actually recycling, circular economies, waste management, and renewable energy, and all the things and above. So our women entrepreneurs, 30,000, I apologize, I told you 20,000, 30,000 women entrepreneurs who've actually been working with almost now 3 million families, are actually physically there to help educate, help people understand what the opportunity is. And we're seeing the gap is that if we don't know what people are doing, we have no idea how to help them change their behavior, right? So even being able to map out what plastics are people using so you can actually recycle it, or even understanding who is using kerosene today that actually will be incentivized for solar. But I think what's happened also is that, as you rightfully said, this is not their doing, right? So the top 10% of people that have created this situation, we believe that it'll be solved by the mass economy of people, because they're more ready to change their behavior if they're incentivized. And there's a big gig economy, green economy opportunity here. So when you look at this on the women's lens perspective, and even the families, to be honest, the climate justice piece that kicks in is they're like, I'm not the reason why the world is suffering. So don't make me make expensive decision changes. if you're not going to incentivize me to make that happen. And I think this has been a big push that we've been putting in, even if you look at this with the solar sector space, right? Like, I'm not going to make a woman adopt a solar appliance that is like 10 times more expensive than a regular appliance solution because we want to save the climate when she wasn't the one that actually made that happen in the first place. So there's something here where we've been pushing economic incentives to like be able to have women change their barriers. So for women, yeah, it's a job. It's an opportunity to earn money. It's also an opportunity to like be a champion of change. But I think what's happened, I think in the last like 5 years, I mean, I've been doing this climate work, as you know, for like 18 years. So for me, the last 5 years has been crazy, right? I mean, Rajasthan, you remember this, the locusts crisis. I mean, you know, we were already dealing with COVID. We were already dealing with lockdown. We were already dealing with mass migration. We were already dealing with job loss. And then you had crazy locusts coming and eating up all the crops in Rajasthan and like just shatter the situation, right? So that is crazy stuff, right? And then like having all these cyclones and having all these realities come in. So like people are not in rural though connecting that to their fault, right? So like I think for them it's split into two elements. One is, can I get a green job and an incentive to fix the first world's problems or the top 5 people's consumption situation that's made me suffer in the first place? That's one piece. And second is, given that you've destroyed my livelihood because of the decisions that you've all made with the changes of climate, how do you give me the right tools to be resilient to make sure of that? And I'll give you one last stat on this. When those locusts came in, we only look in agri belts in Rajasthan and UP, and legitimately people lost so much crops. Government had given a crop insurance. Do you know the value of that crop insurance was 500 rupees, and they lost 40,000 rupees, right? So somewhere or the other, I think it's all about also understanding that because they're not the ones instrumentally involved in the climate crisis, they were not the ones that made it happen. How do we also ensure that we protect them in a different way, which again goes back to education, but I would also say incentives and market linkages.
Amazing. I'm gonna come back to this question of access to energy debate versus renewable energy debate and the price differential. I know you're passionate about it, and I think it's really worth discussing. Eric, when you hear all of this, I guess one big question is, does it connect with philanthropists? Like, philanthropists started with sort of these, they started on the science side, and yet philanthropy is the most flexible capital to really deal with the human side. Doesn't have to worry about all these political cycles. Are you seeing this resonate? How are you making them see all of this?
We making them see, yeah. I think it depends on the philanthropist. It depends on the place in the world the philanthropist is. It depends on what their lived experience and therefore what they understand as their own particular theory of change might be. But I agree that the argument that the science and the numbers and the math convinces people to act has been proven not to be the case. I think that most people now, and what we do at CLI in bringing new philanthropists into the space, is to ensure that they're educated around the fact that whether or not they see social justice or economic justice as the center of the bullseye of their particular giving, that they recognize that it is necessary to make any of the change they see, even if they're counting molecules, durable, right? So even if someone is very focused on the technology side of how do we create new materials or how do we suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere mechanically, that in order to do that effectively, you need license to be able to do that. It's infrastructure that traditionally when you develop that kind of infrastructure in places around the world, but like in the United States specifically, it is traditionally marginalized, vulnerable communities, essentially. So it's not just a build it and solve for it, it's a understanding the full wraparound on that. And I think that is for the traditional climate funding community, a newer development, even in the past three plus years, where I think there's been a disproportionate focus on mitigation at sometimes not the expense of adaptation, there we go. But that there was seen as more of a trade-off there, right? It was more of a how can we, and not that I'm necessarily suggesting I agree with this or what have you. I can project too if I need to. That you need to stop the bleeding, right? That was part of it. And for better or worse, that was part of the thinking there. But increasingly, and as you're seeing new philanthropists enter into the space with their own ideas and thinking, it has become less black and white about, is this adaptation or is this mitigation? Is this social justice? Is this about removing molecules? It is an understanding of that you need to do all of these things. Now, it is such a big problem. And I say this often, is that when we're talking about climate change, we're not talking about one thing. We're talking about changing everything, changing the way that we do everything. And so it becomes a very daunting prospect, even for those with significant capacity to figure out where do they place their bets, how are they ensuring that they're placing those bets in the right places that are going to have the maximal impact in whatever way they feel that that's their own particular area of focus, where they're coming from as a family, as an individual, or even as a corporation. And how do you match those interests to ensure that there is a broad swath, a broad base of impact that's measured, that's not only, again, about removing gigatons from the atmosphere or transitioning to clean energy sources, but you're doing it with the entirety of how are we changing the way that we build, eat, drive, communicate, teach, learn in general. And that intersectionality and those co-benefits become both a kind of rallying cry to get in off of the sidelines, but also in understanding, taking the systematic approach to understanding how change actually works, rather, and there are competing theories there around trust-based philanthropy versus kind of effective altruism-based philanthropy too, which are interesting to get into in terms of understanding how that motivates people.
Thanks, Eric. And it would be great to come back to you about a challenge that I think Ajaita raised as well, which is there is that financing gap between the right solution versus who's paying for that solution. And then there's always a question of the role philanthropy can play maybe to catalyze, obviously not to fill, because that's a huge gap that we're describing. So we'll just come back to that. Safina, you spoke about the role of education in getting people to make the right decisions, right? But I mean, I remember in your TED talk as well, I think you mentioned this, how the drawdown report spoke about actually just educating a girl itself is a solution because, it has multiple effects. Could you just say a bit more about that? Because I think we often don't realize the many different ways in which we can, there's always technology is always the way we sort of talk about the solution side. And I think that particular example that you give would be really instructive for us.
Yeah, no, I think people need to remember a couple of things. One is that women and girls are 14x more likely to die in climate disasters. Not because of biology, but because of marginalization. Right? Because their status in society is so low that they will be at the front lines of dying from this. The other thing, and this was insane, it kind of blew my mind when I saw the map, because I work and my focus is with the out-of-school girl, right? Because in the larger scheme of things, that's really at the bottom. If you're out of school, that means you are the most vulnerable. And the out-of-school girl hotspot map is, South Asia, so you're India, Pakistan, Afghanistan now, right? Like that whole sort of South Asia is the hotspot. And then like center of Africa, the countries like bang in the center. That's where the highest sort of number of out-of-school girls are concentrated. I saw this map that blew my mind, which was the 15 top countries that are highest at risk of climate disasters, right? From water scarcity and from food insecurity, because your agricultural patterns will go haywire and all the rest of it. And guess what? You could have put those two maps one on top of the other. Right? Apart from the island countries and Chota Mara idhar udhar, like basically it is one on top of the other. This is what is most vulnerable from a climate lens. This is most vulnerable from the gender lens, from the need lens, from everything, right? It's like insane. And we need to open our eyes up to that fact. Right? Everybody is not going to suffer equally. They are going to be on the front lines. They're going to be on the front lines. So women have to, like during the pandemic, we started doing food delivery. We're a girls' education organization. Because we realized that even in normal times in our households, women and girls eat last. They serve everybody, even in rich households. I don't know, hot roti, I'll make, then I will sit and eat, right? Like it's the serving of the thing. They do the serving. And we were like, in the pandemic, when the food is less, who is going to go hungriest? So multiply that vulnerability with climate disasters. Who walks furthest to get water? Who is out there grazing the goats? Who is, you know, all of these things, they fall on the women. And Aparna, don't look at your phone. What happens to like human organs? Don't they like just sort of boil, melt something like at temperatures which are like insanely high, right? And so who is going to suffer from that level of, she's a doctor, so she will, I'm saying the right thing, no? Yeah. It is. Look at me.
You need to say yes.
And I think we really need to, you know, I'm allergic to jargon, so I speak in simple human language. We really, honest to God, need to open our eyes on this and see, but the good bit is these are also opportunities for action. When problems are concentrated, when vulnerabilities are concentrated, there are actually massive opportunities for philanthropy, et cetera, to do surge of resources, to add speed, scale, action, get together and like do stuff. And so I think that's what I would like to say is there is vulnerability, but there's also incredible opportunity. And we need to open our eyes to, and we need to start talking about those vulnerabilities in human terms, rather than just tech terms or, you know, whatever, scientific terms.
Ajay, I promised that we should get into this question of climate justice and who pays, because you know, India's made a move. I mean, even I was with Sunitha in 2008 when all she spoke about was climate justice, and now we are certainly saying, look, there's climate justice, but there is a need to think about the opportunities. But climate justice is still there, right? The women you work with shouldn't be the ones paying. Yeah. So I want you to just sort of, in a sense, quantify this for us. Like, what is that opportunity space? What needs to be funded?
So can I just first say, is this the first time we're on a panel together? Like in a panel together? Like you just do like all my work, which is awesome. So we should just do a roadshow together more often, because that was really helpful. Could not agree more with everything you just said. Okay, so just need to get that out of my system. Safina. On climate justice and opportunity. I'm gonna give a very simple example to put this in perspective. You remember this, Gaurav. A couple of years ago, there was a massive movement on the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves. We had a massive, massive push around talking about why, you know, clean cook stoves was going to be the game-changing solution to help in the climate, you know, movement, because indoor air pollution is horrible and women are using these chulas and it's really bad. Do not disagree. Those chulas are horrendous, right? I mean, every single woman, 100 million plus women just in India are using these horrendous chulas to cook, and it is horrible health implications, indoor air pollution, et cetera, et cetera. Agreed. I spend many, many days in villages sitting with these women and trying to get the emotional other realities also about why it's isolating. And there's nothing like inhaling all that smoke and trying to make food really quickly for people than tell you that like the namak is incorrect, right? Like you want to slap them and you can't, because as a woman, this is your responsibility, right? To be there. So what's the solution, right? The solution was, let's create biomass clean cook stoves and all these other lovely different companies, and you all know who I'm talking about, because let's be real, we all have been there, and they were horrible. They were like the worst cook stoves I've ever seen in my life, because if you don't understand how quickly women have to make rotis, you're never going to be able to understand that she's never going to use this cook stove on her own. Then there was the Ujjwala scheme for the LPG cook stoves and blah, blah, blah. And you forgot that at the end of the day, like when you're giving expensive LPG gas to women, because they are the center of economic decisions for their family to save money, et cetera, because they're the managers of the world, you are not helping them when you think that there's a one cooking solution solves all. All of us in our kitchens have like hundreds of devices for our cooking solutions. So the fact that we were being this ridiculous, in our opinion, of trying to get women to be at the center of the climate movement, because we believe that indoor air pollution is the worst thing for carbon emission, you're giving them expensive cook stoves, expensive financing, and then you're ridiculing them for not using it because it does not solve the problem. That's the climate justice problem, right? And in my opinion, that's ridiculous, right? Pay her, give her a free cook stove, pay her to use it, And therefore, you get your carbon emission story, get whatever random carbon trader that exists to pay for that carbon trade emission, and make this into a sustainable market-based problem. Awesome. But we don't think that way, right? We're not thinking about economies of scale. We're not actually focusing on the fact that at the end of the day, if I just look at India, my second example is 100 million farmers are women. And no one understands that if you actually incentivize them to change their farming practices, because they're more willing to do it than anybody else, if you pay them correctly, again, you create this massive carbon emission shift, which someone else should be paying for. It's not these women. We keep coming down with the same idea that I know what's good for you. Let me give you an expensive solution. I will not pay you. I will not train you. I will not incentivize you. But I want to make sure that you're the reason why my carbon emission story shifts. And this has been our problem, right? So like ultimately at the end of the day, when we're thinking about whether it's a solar appliance, whether it's a clean cook stove, whether it's a renewable energy solution, whether it's better agri practices, whatever it may be, guys, like let's really understand that market dynamics are real. Incentivize the right people. Do not make them become the payer. Make someone else be the payer, because at the end of the day, you can create much better sustainable outcomes at scale, right? So we've literally said She Leads Bharat is all about where women are at the center of climate change. Pay them to do the job that you're not willing to do.
Well, okay, I mean, I love what you're saying, but I think there are sticky areas there too, right? Like you mentioned, you know, let's pay them to use these cook stoves. Well, I mean, the reality is LPG works really well. It's expensive. So why not pay them to use LPG? Well, I mean,
Agreed, but why? But then let's go there. Let's pay them to use the LPG. Right now, they're only using 30% of the LPG for their cooking because it's an expensive gas. So they only use it for making chai and, you know, heating their water. Pay them to make it for their subsies, and you'll see.
No, I think that's right. But this is where I want Eric to come in, because look, LPG isn't exactly climate friendly, right? So I mean, and that's the big question, right? Because there are things around development which actually are real tensions. I mean, I think we love to say that there is just magic bullet solutions, but there is a need to think about indoor air pollution, and that has a strong development outcome long term, but I mean, are people willing to fund that? I know that's a very specific question. I do want to get into how you're going to catalyze, but, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that is a sticking point for some philanthropists. And I think there's also a kind of nested thinking in some of that there are point solutions, and this goes into some of the criticisms of effective altruism, where it's how many stoves do you buy, how many, you know, where you're looking at point solutions versus systematic solutions. There obviously, yeah, LPG is still a natural gas product. It is polluting. Is it better than burning something even dirtier? Yeah, yes, it is. And do we need to understand that there's a reality and a progression here that we get to, and it's not about flipping a switch and turning everything into like a miraculous, perfectly clean situation? Absolutely. I think there's the reality of transitions. It is not instantaneous. Now, there's similar arguments and questions around just sort of development in general, and looking at Africa inclusive of that. And there's a number of things tied into that, not only kind of how you're powering the continent, but how are you then looking at future industry and things like electric vehicles and mining and all of that, which has a possibility of reinventing all the same problems that were caused by other extractive industries, right? It's complicated. That's where philanthropy is useful, because it can help navigate that complication. It is not looking for return. I think all these market systems and putting them to play to good use and thinking of it from that perspective, super useful. If you can use philanthropy to create policies, decisions that help to incentivize the right kinds of behavior or eliminate the green premiums or what have you, that's a special role that philanthropy can play in all of that. Not buying the cook stoves, I don't think, necessarily. I don't think that is necessarily an effective use of it. You can quote me on that one, maybe. But I think that's where you start to think about, it's not the lesser of two evils. It is about a steady reduction and bending the curve and getting to a place where you're maximizing the amount of change that you can help to catalyze through thinking very strategically about where you place those dollars, doing it in coordination with each other, government, business, all at the same table as much as possible at the same time.
So Erica, just on that, because there's a bunch of philanthropists, I'm sure, I hope, here. Who's rich here? No? Okay, no. But please give examples. Like, you know, I think there was a move from like where we now finally realize climate is an enormous problem philanthropy can only catalyze, what are some really good examples of where philanthropists have made specific investments and the world has followed them in?
I think in electric vehicle adoption, there was a big movement over the past couple of years for an initiative called Drive Electric, which is about ending the internal combustion engine. And I think there was the potential kind of false hope that the Teslas of the world were going to get there on their own. Even with the Teslas and the Fords, and they're making as many cars as they can sell right now, so I don't necessarily even think that that's quite there yet, but it is, how are we using philanthropy to accelerate that even further? I think there's another one around methane emissions, right? And this is all about how are you buying time, right, to tick off the clock, and some of those are related to environmental and health kind of related needs in communities where there are leaks, or thinking about what that looks like from an off-gassing perspective. So those are areas that have been accelerated pretty quickly through philanthropic means. And I think that you're starting to see things, and jury's still out on this, and this is at the tech end of the spectrum too, just to be clear, around carbon dioxide removal, where you're seeing companies go in and creating markets and saying, we are willing to pay the premium. Or you have the First Movers Coalition, which is, a consortium of companies saying, listen, we know that going into this world, this realm is going to be a competitive disadvantage for us in the short term. But if we all kind of stick to it together, and we're all holding each other's hands to the fire and making this happen, then we're doing the right decision, we're creating the market, and we're bending that curve more quickly.
Great examples. I'm going to, oh great, I was looking for a clock. Thank you. You're the clock. All right, excellent. I think that means we should try and see if there's one or two questions from the...
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Just because this week obviously has been a very interesting week around gender and climate, and really trying to shift the narrative from tech to people. The question that obviously a lot of us are asking is that if we are able to understand that, especially in the developing countries that we're operating in, there is the power of economies of scale. There is that power of, in India, it's 800 million people. In Africa, it's like billions of people that ultimately today are just deprived of like regular access to energy, which is where the access to energy, renewable energy space has been around for like a decade. But somewhere it's been lost between that and the climate space. And so the question is like, are we able to merge those things together and then start understanding that the people problem, to incentivize people to maybe, take on biodegradable sanitary napkins, like do things like recycling, get involved more in, and I think what Safina had said earlier, which was that like, it's not gonna be the top 10% of people that are used to bad consumption practices. It's actually the people that are most vulnerable that are willing to do it. Is there a space for philanthropic capital to start looking at this more significantly and, building that coalition around climate for people and climate justice is the question.
And I'll answer to the best of my ability, but there are people out there that are actually doing this work that are doing incredible work. I mean, I think one specific example is this initiative called AFR 100, right? It's WRI, Bezos, Earth Funds involved in it as well, where it's incentivizing entrepreneurs to think about how they're ending deforestation in Africa, right? So that is clear catalytic capital from a philanthropic source that's going to support a broader effort that then engages markets to be able to create jobs and go out there and do the work that is beneficial to climate and also supportive of the communities that are going to be most affected by that. I think in many ways, and some of this is my own opinion, that that is the only way we get out of all this. If we're not paying attention to this, then not only will we have challenges in tackling climate in and of itself, but all of the inequalities and all of the social and political unrest that will result from all of that. I don't want to paint too dire a picture about it, but the flip side of that is that there is an incredible amount of opportunity, and there is a concentration of both actual know-how, how you make these things work on the ground, a will, and also I think it's, it is lots of people look at it as an opportunity, and it certainly is that too, but it is also, you know, it is effective altruism in the way that you're saving your own life by doing a lot of this work, right? And even, you know, you're thinking about it from the perspective of how you most effectively using the funding that you have allocated, even among those of us, those folks who have significant capability, in a way that feels targeted and coordinated with the broader effort. And that's where it is, again, as a funder community, as a funded community, trying to build those linkages to other areas of that system to cooperate. And I think that's been a significant challenge too. I think, you know, not only without the climate community, but also within the climate community, right? And bringing those linkages together.
Thanks, Eric. We have a question over here.
Actually, Gaurav, while the mic is getting to you, can I just make one practical suggestion for philanthropists? There's a lot of like high-level stuff.
I do have a call to action at the end, but if you want to give your call to action now, you can. Go for it.
No, I was going to be the Indian auntie who's giving some practical tips out here.
Go.
As we think about the climate thing, the big things, some basic things, I think, basic that we can do today. In Madhya Pradesh, you know, Educate Girls has 2,500 full-time employees, 20,000 community workers. In Madhya Pradesh, I lost 8 to 10 man days because the temperature was hitting 50 degrees centigrade. Yep. In Prayagraj, I lose man days because the flooding has happened. Blah, blah, blah. This is happening every day. All those philanthropists, in your grant agreements, please give flex. I hope everybody's only funding unrestricted. Yeah. Which obviously everybody is, right? But give heavier contingencies because we are rolling with the punches. So I think, and these are quick things that can be done, but philanthropists need to make these changes like super, super, super fast.
Also let us like change our budget lines.
Arey, please.
Like, let us change our budget lines when there's chaos.
Wait, let's just hear from the audience as well. Yeah, go for it.
Hi, Safina. Hi, everyone. This is Girish here from People. So right now, I work with this education nonprofit. But Ajayta, you just sent me back down memory lane. I think 12 years ago, I was part of that, working in a village, trying to move from kerosene to solar lamps, interestingly, beyond Sholapur. But I have a slightly zoomed out question. So when I look at this journey, whether it's education or whether it is climate, there are certain macro factors that come into play, and there are certain narratives that become prevalent. For example, this year's UNGA, goalkeepers, this discussion, everything focuses on climate, and climate is getting that convergence of belief around action and a specific set of actions today. What I was just curious about is, given your decades of experience, where do you think, or how does this narrative actually form, saying this is the answer, until it then no longer is a couple of years later when there's a better answer? And I guess for the people in the room, what would be that highest leverage point to, or 1, 2, or 3 highest leverage points where they should focus on to build or strengthen the narrative?
I love this question. I actually think that you're right. I mean, it's always trendy, right? Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, to blah, blah, blah. And you're always like kind of in it, trying to navigate what that trend will be so you can get that capital. I think for me, in the last like 2 decades, what's been consistent is listening to the voice of rural people and actually being able to like use a data-centric approach to understand who they are and what they need and bridge that gap through the right partnerships. And the second is invest in women. I just think the gender piece, honestly speaking, is like, I don't care. I mean, you know, if you look at just India, right, technically speaking, we've invested in self-help group networks, 80 million women, for decades, billions of dollars, and yet still, we're talking about economic empowerment for them, and we're still trying to understand how to better leverage that network, and we're still trying to understand how to better solve for all these problems. You're right, today it's climate, tomorrow it's gonna be healthcare. It was healthcare before. It was healthcare like a year ago, right? Wasn't it in healthcare like about a year ago, Aparna? Was it not? Come on, COVID. What do you mean? But like, you know, and then it's data for good, and then it's technology. It's a trend. I think the parallel consistency that we need to think about is that it's a people voice. It's about a bottoms-up approach. It's about building skills and capacity. It's about leveraging technology. It's about championing entrepreneurs that are on the ground, the frontliners, the front workers, the field staff. Like, they're the center at this, right? So whatever the philanthropic trend is, I think if we can navigate ourselves around the fact that the solutions will be around people, tech, and systems, I think maybe that will allow us to navigate whatever trend comes in next, right, is my answer.
what she said, yeah.
Mary Robinson actually said it's a man-made problem, but the solution is feminist.
That is right. Yes.
I'm sorry. I've been told to conclude. So you're going to hear their call to action in person. I'm going to invite you to mob them as soon as we get off the stage to hear their call to action, because unfortunately we've run out of time. So really appreciate your patience on this, and thank you, panelists. That was fantastic. Thank you for bringing a lot of energy to this room. And thank you all.
Another round of applause for the, I mean, come on, look at the energy that was just phenomenal. I did want to thank all our panelists, but also, and just stay with us for a few more minutes. We are going to wrap this up, and I will try and keep this brief. But Gaurav and all our panelists, thank you so much for doing exactly what you said you would at the beginning of the session, which is centering a few things, right? Intersectionalities, centering the human in all of this, and centering philanthropy and the role that it can play. Sorry, if I know Gaurav said y'all can mob them. If I can request y'all to mob